to the Talk About Teddy podcast, conversations exploring the world of Theodore Roosevelt. I'm your host, Kurt Skinner, and I'm joined as ever by my good pal and co-host, Larry Marple. You're listening to part 2 of our conversation with Edward O'Keefe, the CEO of the TR Presidential Library Foundation and author of the new TR book, The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, The Women Who Created a President. To listen to the first part of our conversation with Ed, go to episode 14 at the Talk About Teddy podcast.
Bammy had some influence in this next question. TR would return to New York for various visits and encountered his first love, Edith. Could you describe their courtship?
It was like everything in Theodore Roosevelt's life, sudden and impulsive. Theodore did return multiple times to New York, of course. He didn't stay every day in North Dakota for the better part of those 2 years. But a particularly significant moment happened in October of 1885. He came back for a hunt at what would become Sagamore Hill. He encountered Edith as Theodore is coming down the stairwell, and Edith enters the home, and suddenly confronted in front of him is the one person he had explicitly said to Bammy, I do not want to see. I think, of course, probably talked about it on this podcast many times, right? He's pacing the Ferris General Store at the bedroom upstairs. I have no constancy. He knows that if he sees Edith, all the feelings, all of the love will come rushing back, and there will be nothing that he can do to live up to this Victorian code of never remarrying, and of course, honor, and somehow dishonoring Alice and Alice's memory by reuniting with Edith. Now, what I find interesting is who set that up. History doesn't know, because he's told Bammy, I don't want to see her. And there is some evidence that Bammy was not particularly won over by Edith coming back in. I mean, remember with Alice, they had a woman who was willing to share Theodore with them. Edith, she's been the bonus sister. She's always on the outside looking in. She's the one hiding her shabby toys when the Roosevelts come over. She's the one who doesn't get to go on the grand tours of Europe and elsewhere. I would imagine there's a little bit of tension there when Edith comes back into the fold, and suddenly the person who's always been a little bit on the outside looking in is the most important woman in Theodore's life. My theory, and I couldn't prove it, but I'll go ahead and share it. I think that Aunt Anna is the prime suspect in who leaked the engagement to the New York Times. I think Aunt Anna is the one who wrote the incredibly devastating account of Alice's birth and Alice's death. And I think Aunt Anna was the one who knew that Edith was the one who could bring Theodore back, and maybe was the one who even set up that meeting, because it probably wasn't Bammy, but there it was. And so very quickly, within 6 weeks, they were secretly engaged, told hardly anyone. And Edith, of course, goes to Europe. Moves to Europe while TR goes back to Dakota. Now that is holding up the subterfuge. But what I love is that, of course, this reinvigorates TR. There's 2 births at the Elkhorn. Suddenly the Elkhorn, his respite is becoming more like a daycare. He's
I like that line.
And suddenly he's speaking about this séduction of Patty Selms. Clearly something's been awakened in our Theodore Roosevelt, that he's seeing women with new eyes again and enjoying life in a way that he really wasn't able to during that 12 to 18 months of mourning.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up Aunt Anna. This would be Mitty's sister. Because you note that young Teedy and young Edie are both being homeschooled as kids under the tutelage of Aunt Anna. And so you said really from the beginning they were kindred book lovers. I like how you bring up Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. You can't help but think how how young Titi would obviously, this would evoke those strong women characters, holding the family together while the father is off at war doing his duty, and that would clearly resonate with a young Titi. I was going to ask if there's anything more you wanted to share about those childhood experiences that Edith had with the Roosevelt siblings, how important that was in those connections later in life.
Well, Edith had a much harder life, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Edith has an alcoholic father, and she's watching the degradation of his reputation and their family fortune. She's got to be looking on with some degree of jealousy at the Roosevelts' seemingly perfect family, joyful and happy together, even though, of course, you have this, bitter divide, a house divided and a nation divided during the Civil War. And yet Mitty and Thee disagree without being disagreeable. What an incredible example to their children. And Edith doesn't have that. Edith is growing up in a very different circumstance. You brought up the literary references that I make in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt to Little Women, and of course, TR's interest in Poe. I think when you're a sickly child, particularly in an era where there's incredible smog and dust and just horrible sanitary conditions in New York, Theodore Roosevelt is living a life of the mind. He's not the Rushmore Roosevelt that we know and think of today. He's living life through books and imagination. And I think in many times in his life, he did see things that were happening through the lens of the plot of a novel. Or, he wrote, his life is almost in that kind of, if you wrote Theodore Roosevelt's story and submitted it to Simon & Schuster as the next book after the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, it would get rejected. It's too outlandish. There's too many twists and turns, and yet he does. I could see him relating to his family experience and his father's absence in the way that is written in Little Women. I could see, he's bringing up Poe at various points in his life. And, I write the poem Annabel Lee in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt because to wonder, is the lost Lenore, is the lost Annabel Lee, is he thinking of Alice or is he thinking of Edith at these moments? Because in a strange way, there's this poetic symmetry to the idea that TR, after this tragic loss, is brought back to the woman that would restabilize his life and allow him to accomplish these extraordinary things that he wouldn't have been able to do alone.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. In your book, you list Edith's accomplishments and her influence as First Lady. Could you describe some of those for our listeners?
How much time do you have?
I know.
Well, we'll just go through we'll play the hits here. Edith is the first lady to hire a social secretary, Belle Hagner. This will revolutionize the role, and every single successor from that moment on will have a social secretary. Edith arranges for the reconstruction of the White House, hires the architect, creates a difference between the executive. She creates a place from which the executive function of government in the United States occurs. She has a family. She has 6 children. Now, not all of them are in the house at the same time, but she wants a private residence and a public component of the White House. So they will create the East Wing and the West Wing. They will create what becomes the Oval Office, and they will talk about how this is no longer the executive mansion, but the White House. Mm-hmm. She will create a colonial garden, which will later become the Rose Garden. She will design the offices on the second floor in the private residence and literally put hers right next to Theodore. So she's the first person he sees in the morning and the last person he talks to at night. She'll read 4 to 5 newspapers a day and talk through every part of the news that he needs to know. She goes on long walks and advises him on every major appointment and every major decision. She does some other things that are aesthetic, but still to this day influential. She collects the first china that becomes the White House China collection, and then we'll go back in prior administrations and have the donation of those administrations' china. She'll establish the First Lady's portraits, which still hang in the White House to this day. She begins salons, which Jacqueline Kennedy will become renowned for the salons that they hold, the artists and the writers and the musicians who will come and play at the White House. That starts with Edith.
Yeah.
They entertain 40,000 people in their first year in the White House. And she does all of this with grace and ease and being almost completely unaffected. One of my favorite quotes about Edith is from Margaret Chandler, who was a friend of theirs from the early days as civil service commissioner all the way through the end of their life. And Margaret Chandler will say that, that of Edith, just as the camera comes into focus, Edith steps out of view as the shutter is clicked. And that's Edith, right? She just she's unaffected and by the hoopla. She enjoys perhaps being at the center of activity and attention, but she doesn't need it like TR does. He's the politician. He's the extrovert. She's the quiet and reserved and very determined and extraordinarily intelligent advisor.
Yeah, there's a definite passing of the baton there from Bammy to Edith as soon as they're married, and that's really a very similar role, I guess, that Bammy had played as that behind the scenes influencer who just out of view. That's
just
that's
out of view.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of the administration, right, McKinley is assassinated, and Ida McKinley needs to move out of the White House. They want to respectfully give her time to do so. The first cabinet meetings, the first actions of the Roosevelt administration are at 1733 N Street, Bammy's home, which becomes known in the press as the Little White House. I mean, she quite literally, her home became the White House because of the president's presence. And, she'll continue to advise her brother, but it is always a delicate dance. Where's Edith's role? Where's Bammy's role? What's Connie's role? But they all continue to be in support of him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're right that Edith was in the room where it happened because she designed it that way. And you also share this quote, whenever I go against her judgment, I regret it. Obviously, talking about Edith there. So would you care to elaborate on Edith's influence on Roosevelt during his presidency in particular?
Well, let's take that, whenever I go against her judgment, I regret it. By the way, whenever I talk about that quote amongst if a man and woman are present and they're married, there's always a smile on the face of the woman and kind of a look of acknowledgement from the man. Like, yeah, that's probably true. I think, none other than Henry Stimson, who's lately been of increased fame because of the popularity of the movie Oppenheimer and the credible book that preceded it, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book American Prometheus. Stimson will advise Truman on the selection of sites for the atomic bomb. I mean, he serves in multiple administrations from Theodore Roosevelt forward. So this is a person who's known for exquisite judgment and incision. And he says of Edith that whenever she was a part of the decision making, Theodore Roosevelt made better decisions. I put it this way: whenever Theodore Roosevelt was impulsive or didn't do something that Edith had recommended, it was a mistake. And whenever he did follow her advice, he was generally successful. I mean, now think about 1912, right? She literally is the only person who levels with him and says, "Put it out of your mind, Theodore. You will never be president of the United States again." That is not something he wanted to hear. And she has a horse accident and basically suffers what is undoubtedly a concussion. And it is during those moments that TR conspires with his younger sister, Connie, to gather the supportive governors and put his hat in the ring for 1912. Now, eventually she comes around and joins the excitement and hoopla of the campaign and begins to believe, but she saw the situation more pragmatically than he did. That it's probably not going to work out. Doesn't mean it's not worth trying, but just politically, you're never going to be president of the United States again. And date that back to the decision on election eve of 1908. I mean, the most mysterious political decision that Theodore Roosevelt ever made, declaring that he would not be a candidate for president again in 1908, at the apotheosis of his greatest political achievement, winning elected office to the presidency in his own right. He made himself a lame duck. Edith, there's debate about whether Edith was in the room or not to witness that, but undoubtedly she wasn't consulted because she did not think that was a good decision, and indeed probably the worst political decision in terms of practical politics that TR ever made.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he. What is it, Larry? Did he say he'd probably given a limb to be able to take that statement back?
And with the 1912 election, Edith made the comment to TR that nothing but regret would come of this. Right. So she knew.
Nothing but regret will come of this. And indeed, that's right. I mean, the most successful independent candidacy in the history of the United States. Yeah. He won the nomination, but it was denied him. It's a quintessential Rooseveltian battle. Does it matter if you won as long as you strove valiantly and fought the good fight? But nonetheless, that shows you she's pragmatic. She understands the political circumstances. He's more impulsive, and that impulsivity is both his greatest strength and his worst weakness.
Yes.
Exactly the same as was described Mitty. Impulsive, a lively lass with impulsivity. She says to Theodore, what my temperament is. I am impulsive.
Mm-hmm.
Once you tie these pieces together, who is TR? He is his father's son, but he is his mother's son. Yeah. He is the spitting image of his mother, and that impulsivity and that personality. And then you've got this pragmatic woman like Edith, who is the opposite of Alice, trying to rein him in. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you provided in the book an excellent explanation of the family origin of Edith's middle name, Kermit, and the name of their second son. Now, it might seem like a minor thing to some of our listeners, but in the work Kurt and I have done with the public, and what you've done with the public, I'm sure, too, we get the question often, where does the name Kermit come from? Would you mind sharing your findings?
What? Isn't that extraordinary? So I was out in Medora, North Dakota, with a lovely woman, Priscilla Roosevelt, the wife of Kermit Roosevelt. And she tells me this story that is in the book. She said, well, the origin of the name Kermit. And I said, well, I mean, I think I know. I mean, Kermit and Corot, and I kind of go through it. And she says, well, no. But she said, I swear that this is in a book somewhere. And I looked and I said, it's not in a book anywhere. I haven't heard this story before. So the version. So Edith's father, Charles Corot, was in business with Robert Kermit. And so they were business partners in Kermit and Corot, the shipping company. Mm-hmm. Edith's parents' first child was a son whom they named Kermit because Robert Kermit had basically saved them from financial ruin. Mm-hmm. Robert Kermit had put them up in his home, had loaned them money, had really been there for Charles when he suffered the worst of his alcoholism and was beginning this decline in his life. And the Robert Kermit never had any children, and so when the family asked, what can we do to possibly repay you and honor you, he said, well, I have no sons to carry my name forth into the next generation. Would you consider naming your son for me? And indeed, Charles and Gertrude had a son. That son, who would have been Edith's older brother, died in infancy before he was even 1 year old. They had named him Kermit. So when Edith was born, they replicated the honor and named her Edith Kermit Carew. And that is the origin of the name Kermit, which, of course, then she named one of her sons Kermit, and the name carries down to this day.
Yeah.
Well, before we go, we need to get over to Sister Corinne.
Yeah.
I love
So could you talk a little bit about Connie, as she was known in the family, Corinne Roosevelt Robinson's really unofficial and maybe sometimes unwelcome role as TR's press secretary?
Well, I'll admit to you, Larry and Kurt, because I would presume the listeners of this fine podcast are what we affectionately call at the TR Library our TED heads.
Mm-hmm.
They're the believers. So if you listen to the audio, right, the pronunciation that the family had was Corrine. And I recorded the audio book of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, and I said, look, technically it would be Corrine, but absolutely no one will ever understand why we are calling her Connie and then saying Corrine. So I will admit that if you get the audio book of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I am copying to it. We called her Connie, and that's her name, book and on the audio book. But I think Connie would be okay with it because she was, as I described in the book, TR's unofficial press secretary, the press secretary before the role existed. Eleanor Roosevelt would essentially say that if you wanted advice, you go to Bammy. If you want sympathy, you go to Connie. Mm-hmm. She was more emotional. She was she was poetic. She was indeed a poet. She wrote books of poetry, had a really fascinating and interesting life on her own, had not a great marriage, and with that not great marriage really funneled more of her energy into her brother. But practically what Connie would do is, I love this example. So when TR is governor, Connie will come in from New Jersey and actually in Bammy's home sit in on meetings that the governor is having with Boss Platt. And when eventually the breakfast is over, Boss Platt will say, everybody clear out. And the governor will say, well, surely my sister can say, she's so interested in all that I do. And so Connie would stay, and they take advantage of the sexism of the age. Connie would stay in the room, hear everything that happened, so much so that Theodore will say to Connie, haven't we had fun being governor of New York? No. That's how much they were discussing and thinking through the issues of the day when TR is governor. Fast forward, Connie understands that TR's advantage is his reputation in the press. She will slip heroics of his time in Cuba. She'll slip stories of the rambunctious home life to the press. She will do this over Edith's objection. Edith wants to keep her family private and will reluctantly participate in some of the events of a public family, but Connie will repeatedly take details of the tales that they will have with the nephews and sons and make sure that the press falls in love with this incredible family, their pets and their crazy antics in the White House. And that's all Connie intuitively understanding that the TR had a power in the public perception.
And continues that role even after his death, right? With the writing of, it was my brother Theodore Roosevelt, kept that that going.
Exactly. No, I mean, that's it, Kurt, right? I mean, they will say, one of Connie's grandchildren will say, where's your platform, grandmother? Because they're so used to seeing her get on a platform and give a speech. She's the first woman to address a major party convention, the 1920 convention. The New York Times literally says the timbre of her voice, the mannerisms of her speech are so evocative. Surely the convention goers must have thought of Theodore Roosevelt, who could have been the nominee, would have been the nominee at that 1920 Republican convention. Yet it's Connie who's carrying on that legacy. We'll work with Bammy to reestablish the boyhood home. We'll work to establish the American Museum of Natural History as the New York State Memorial to TR. We'll write My Brother Theodore Roosevelt. We'll give speeches across the nation in his name. Connie understood that one of the most important parts of the presidency is the post-presidency. to put him in the pantheon of great presidents, which at the time immediately following his presidency was by no means a sure thing.
Yeah.
She cemented his legacy right alongside Washington and Lincoln and eventually and Jefferson. I mean, that's one of the reasons he's there on Mount Rushmore, is the efforts of his sisters to ensure that Theodore Roosevelt was remembered.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that. It's usually attributed to Churchill, but he said, was that history will be kind to me because I intend to write it.
Oh, I like that one. I like that, Kurt. We're definitely going to use that.
And I know when Corinne wrote My Brother Theodore Roosevelt, Edith and Ted Jr. were livid, and then eventually came around, but yeah, there was a bit of a family rift.
Right?
I mean,
Ted Jr. says, I think that she really believes that she is he now, referring to, right? I mean, what a conflict, right? You're Ted Roosevelt Jr. You're the namesake of your famous father, always trying to live up to that example. And then you've got, your aunt basically supplanting you, and she's got it. You know, she's charismatic and she's lively. Just a quick note. I know we're coming toward the end, but I also want to note that you have only one line of living examples from Theodore and Alice, right? You have Alice Roosevelt Longworth, and now her wonderful descendants. And Alice Roosevelt Longworth is just an incredible character in history. And how could you look at Alice and not think must have had an incredible dynamic mother? I mean, because you have 5 examples from Theodore and Edith, and I would imagine that Ted Jr. had a hard time competing with Connie because she was as lively and charismatic as her brother, and that carried through in a way with TR and Alice, because Alice was a bit more outgoing and spontaneous and athletic, and all these differences from Edith. So, another fascinating way to look at the differences between the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that when Bammy was an adult, she wrote that Theodore is the only person who had the power of making me almost worship him. From early in his life, TR seems to have been the main or central focus of the attention in the Roosevelt family. How unique is that in that time period for a man to have had such adoring support network?
Well, I think that it wasn't unique that women of that era had to find a mechanism in which to channel the energy and the intelligence that they had that society denied them, right? I mean, I think that, as we said, Alice the daughter, will say that had Bammy been a man, she, not TR, would have been president, and Eleanor Roosevelt agreed. That doesn't mean that Bammy wanted to be president necessarily, right? I mean, now, but if she lived 100 years later, she could have been, and it would have been just as expected, and not as unusual to say, well, she's the older sister, she's charismatic, she's intelligent, she's brilliant, she should run for office. So it's a lot of the expectations of the age, and I think you certainly feel that with Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who grows up in this crucible and is such the subject of public attention, and is constrained in many ways by the limitations of her gender in her age.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that Susan B. Anthony and Ida B. Wells, and I mean, there are extraordinary examples of women. Edith Wharton doing the work that she does. There's many, many examples of women who break out of the constraints of their time. But I do think that it was more usual than not that women would have to find an outpost for their prodigious intelligence and energy. And Theodore Roosevelt is pretty lucky to have had this cadre of women in his life, because I really don't think we would have had President Roosevelt without me and Bammy and Connie and Alice and Edith. I mean, I don't think we would.
Well,
Well, Edward, let me pose you a what-if question here.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Many historians will balk at the what-if question, but so as you know, Larry and I do sometimes take on the character of Roosevelt in classrooms and various audiences. I was recently in a 7th grade classroom here locally in Colorado Springs, Mr. Casson's 7th grade class, and he prepared his students well, and I had the question posed to me, would Roosevelt have become president if Alice didn't die at the age of 22?
Oof.
Yeah.
Oof.
Would it
How
have,
did you answer, Kurt?
like, how does that alter TR's trajectory?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, does that permanently alter his trajectory if Alice never died as a young mother?
Well, I will say this. I greatly admire the work of Edmund Morris. I think, and God rest his soul. He did more for the Theodore Roosevelt canon, reviving his reputation and doing that amazing trilogy.
Yeah.
But I take issue, and I do take issue in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt with his description of Alice, and it kind of cruelly suggesting that the best service she ever provided him was passing away. Was leaving his life. I wholeheartedly and vehemently disagree. I think that Theodore Roosevelt, in the 6 years he knew Alice, began to formulate his progressive, reform-minded philosophy. I think that he studied the law and then decided, wait a second, if you want to change the law, you have to run for office. You don't study the law, you change the law.
Yeah.
The only thing Theodore Roosevelt ever quit was the law because he found it ineffective compared to what he could do if he could make the laws. That he did his first major book, The Naval War of 1812, while he was married to Alice. He, in his own words, rose like a rocket and was elected 3 times to the New York State Assembly, still the youngest person ever elected to the New York State Assembly, and nearly became Speaker of that assembly while he was with Alice. I think his life obviously would have taken a different path. I mean, that's right. If the worst thing that ever happened to you didn't happen, your life takes a different path. But I think it's the hard things that happen to us in life that teach us the most. And by no means would anyone ever wish that terrible tragedy on someone. I mean, if Theodore Roosevelt, he would later say, if you take all the memories of my life away, save but one, I want the memory of my time in the Badlands as a rancher and a cowboy, right? I think, you could almost say, well, if he undoubtedly would have wanted his wife to live. He undoubtedly would have wanted to live. Would he have traded everything that came after it to have Alice in his life? Yes. I mean, I think he loved her. He says, nothing, whatever else but you. He loves her so passionately, so deeply, and says, I talk over everything with Alice, from politics to poetry. So do I think he would have followed a different trajectory? Would have it ended in the same place? I would argue probably, yes. I mean, I think, he was a man of destiny, and he had the support system of these incredible people around him, and they were determined to make his life the center of theirs. And that wouldn't have changed. Now, Edith would not have entered the picture in the way that she did, and that undoubtedly would have changed things too. But I think I'll end where I began, which is, my vision of Theodore Roosevelt as a child was the autochthonous will, this sui generis and just almost supernatural ability to find your way through any crisis, and to do that as a self-made man, right? That's not necessarily true. No. It's a great story, and I love a great story, but it's a better story if you say that Theodore Roosevelt, like all of us, needed help. He needed his mother. He needed his sisters. He needed both Alice and Edith in the way that they came into his life at the time they did. And thank God they did, because it made our country a better place.
Yeah.
And it made an example of a person that we can continue to look to today to inspire generations tomorrow. And so that's what I love about the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah, thank you. This has been wonderful. We've really enjoyed having this discussion with you about your book.
Well, Larry, Kurt, I love seeing you out in Medora in the Badlands. I hope we get to do that again this summer. And, I'll watch in the performance if there's a little bit of the Loves of TR coming through from here on out.
Well, Edward O'Keefe, The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, The Women Who Created a President. Terrific new take on Roosevelt as the center of an amazing support network of women who created this man. Don't just take Larry and I's word for it. Again, Kathleen Dalton was a significant contributor to this book. You have on the back page here praise from historians like John Meacham, Candace Millard, Douglas Brinkley.
Yeah.
Wonderful new book. Released. When is this released again, Edward?
May 7th, wherever books are sold. The audio book on the same date. And if you'd like to know more about where I'm going to be appearing and all the book signings and events, edwardfokeefe.com. Please order The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt wherever you like to buy books, and I'd love to see you out there on the road. edwardfokeefe.com. Come see me, and I'd love to say hello.
Well, thank you for what you do, and I'm looking forward to seeing you this summer.
I'm happy we were able to have this conversation today. Larry, Kurt, it's truly been a pleasure. I love talking with folks who love TR as much as me, and I really appreciate all you do.
Well, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening.
You can find this podcast on our website, talkaboutteddy.com, where you can see show notes and transcripts, links to resources, and additional TR content. And please tell us what you think.
If you've enjoyed our content, please consider subscribing and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and family about us, because it really does make a tremendous difference and it helps others find this show.
We hope you'll join us for the next episode of Talk About Teddy. And until then, as our friend Colonel Roosevelt would say,
do what you can with what you have where you are.
Bullet.